The courtroom doors burst open so hard, they slammed against the walls. Every head turned. Even the judge looked up from the stack of documents in front of him. I was already standing beside my attorney, gripping the edge of the defense table with both hands because my knees had started shaking. After 20 years of fighting to survive, after months of watching the Homeowners Association bury me beneath fines I could never afford, after hearing their lawyer spend nearly an hour describing me as a trespasser, a liar, and a career squatter, I thought it was over. The HOA president smiled, without even trying to hide it. Harold Whitmore leaned toward his attorney and whispered something that made both of them chuckle. Across the aisle sat 5 HOA board members wearing expensive suits, their expressions calm and confident. They believed this hearing was just another formality before the judge signed an order, allowing them to seize my little cottage to satisfy nearly $400,000 in accumulated penalties, attorney fees, and interest. The cottage where I'd lived for almost 30 years. The same place where I'd spent every sunrise tending gardens that weren't even mine anymore. The same place where I'd raised 3 little girls who had lost everything. I lowered my eyes. Maybe this was how my story ended. An old groundskeeper with worn-out boots, no savings, no family left, no chance. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly, "before I rule, is there anything further?" My attorney sighed. "Your Honor, unless a miracle walks through that door." The courtroom doors exploded open. 3 women hurried inside. Not running. Walking with the kind of confidence that makes an entire room fall silent. The first wore the dark blue suit of a federal prosecutor. The second carried a leather trial bag embossed with the seal of one of the largest law firms in the state. The third wore a white medical coat, draped over her arm, as if she'd come straight from surgery. Every eye followed them. Harold frowned. His attorney looked irritated. "This hearing is already in progress," he snapped. The first woman ignored him completely. Instead, she looked directly at me, her eyes filled with tears. For a second, I didn't recognize her. Not because she'd changed, because 20 years changes children into strangers. Then she smiled, a smile I hadn't seen since she was barely 8 years old. "Dad," she whispered. The word hit me harder than anything I'd heard in years. I couldn't breathe. "Nora?" She nodded. "You raised all 3 of us," the second woman said, her voice trembling. "Did you really think we'd let them destroy you?" The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Harold laughed nervously. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," he interrupted. "Who exactly are these people?" The youngest woman slowly placed a thick binder onto the evidence table. It landed with a heavy thud. "My name is Dr. Emily Carter." The second introduced herself. "I'm attorney Grace Bennett." Then Nora looked directly at the judge. "And I'm Assistant United States Attorney Nora Hayes." She gently rested one hand on the binder. "We're here because this case isn't about unpaid HOA fines." She paused. "It's about fraud, forged county records, elder financial abuse, and a criminal conspiracy that began over 20 years ago." The color drained from Harold Whitmore's face. His attorney froze. My own lawyer slowly turned toward the binder without saying a word. The judge leaned forward. "What exactly is in that file?" Nora met his eyes. "Everything." She opened the binder to the very first page. Harold suddenly stood so fast, his chair crashed onto the courtroom floor. "No," he whispered. "No, that's impossible." And that was the moment I realized the people who once needed me had come back to save my life. 20 years earlier, no one would have guessed my life would someday end up in a courtroom. Back then, I wasn't thinking about lawsuits, corrupt HOA boards, or county records. I was thinking about grass that needed cutting before the afternoon heat rolled in. My name is Samuel Bennett. I'm 68 years old now, though I was 48 when everything truly began. For almost my entire adult life, I worked as a groundskeeper in Fairview Hills, a quiet suburban community just outside Franklin, Tennessee. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. Every morning before sunrise, I'd climb onto my old riding mower with a thermos of black coffee balanced beside me and spend the day trimming lawns, planting flowers, repairing fences, and cleaning common areas. People often mistook me for part of the landscaping. Most homeowners barely looked up when I passed. Some waved. Many didn't. That never bothered me. A neighborhood isn't beautiful because of expensive houses. It's beautiful because someone quietly cares for it every single day. That someone was usually me. I lived in a small white cottage tucked behind the community greenhouse. It wasn't much to look at. 2 bedrooms, a creaky front porch, faded blue shutters, and a vegetable garden that always seemed to grow more tomatoes than I could eat. But that little house meant everything. My late wife, Margaret, and I had bought it 30 years earlier, with every dollar we'd managed to save. We couldn't afford children of our own. After years of hoping and countless doctor visits, we finally accepted that our family would be just the 2 of us. Margaret used to smile whenever I apologized for not giving her the life I thought she deserved. She'd squeeze my hand and say, "Sam, home isn't measured by who's missing. It's measured by who's loved." After cancer took her, those words became the only thing that kept me moving. For months, I wandered through the empty rooms talking to photographs, as though she could still hear me. Then, one rainy November evening, everything changed. A state social worker knocked on my door. Standing beside her were 3 frightened little girls. The oldest couldn't have been more than 8. The middle child looked 6. The youngest clutched a worn, stuffed rabbit so tightly her tiny knuckles had turned white. Their parents had died in a highway accident 2 nights earlier. There were no grandparents, no aunts, no uncles willing to take them. The social worker looked exhausted. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "I know you volunteered at the Children's Center for years." I nodded. "And the girls already know you." The oldest stepped forward. "You fixed my bicycle." I remembered immediately. Nora. Always curious, always asking questions. Grace hid behind her sister, while little Emily refused to let go of that faded rabbit. The social worker continued, "We're looking for temporary placement while the court decides their future." Temporary. That was the word everyone kept using, but when I looked into those frightened eyes, temporary didn't feel real. I opened my front door. "Well," I said with a nervous smile, "I've got enough soup for 4, and I think there's still some apple pie left." Emily looked up. "Really?" I smiled. "Really?" That temporary arrangement quietly became permanent. Over the years, we built a family from heartbreak. I taught them how to ride bikes, change a flat tire, plant tomatoes, and never leave a shopping cart in the middle of a parking lot. They taught me how to laugh again. Money was always tight. There were birthdays when homemade cakes replaced expensive presents, Christmases when second-hand bicycles appeared under the tree, after I'd spent weeks repairing and repainting them in the garage. Not once did those girls complain. Instead, they hugged me as though I'd given them the world. As they grew older, they studied harder than anyone I'd ever known. Nora dreamed of becoming a prosecutor. Grace wanted to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Emily talked constantly about becoming a doctor after volunteering at the local hospital. I believed every one of them could do it. Then, one by one, they left for college. The house became quiet again, but this time it wasn't lonely. Every Sunday evening, my phone rang. "Dad," Nora would say, "did you remember to eat vegetables this week?" Grace always reminded me to lock the back door. Emily scolded me whenever I ignored my annual checkups. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Or at least, I thought it had. The first sign that something was terribly wrong seemed so small I almost laughed it off. One Monday morning, as I finished trimming the roses outside the neighborhood entrance, I noticed 3 men in expensive suits walking the property with clipboards. They weren't residents. I knew every face in Fairview Hills. One of them pointed toward my cottage. Another unfolded a set of architectural drawings. Then they all smiled. Not the friendly kind of smile people wear when they've already decided something belongs to them. I watched from across the street, pruning shears still in my hand, as one of the men drove a bright orange survey stake straight into the ground, right at the edge of my front yard. Something deep in my stomach tightened. I didn't know who they were. But for the first time in 30 years, my home no longer felt safe. I stood there for nearly a minute, staring at that bright orange survey stake sticking out of my front yard. It looked completely out of place, like a warning. I set my pruning shears on the mower and walked across the street. The 3 men had already rolled up their blueprints and were heading toward a black luxury SUV parked along the curb. "Morning," I called. "Can I help you with something?" The oldest of the 3 turned around slowly. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than everything hanging in my closet combined. Instead of answering my question, he looked me up and down. Grass stains on my jeans, work boots covered in dirt, a faded Fairview Hills Grounds Department shirt. He smiled politely, but there wasn't a trace of kindness behind it. And you are? Samuel Bennett. His eyebrows lifted slightly. The groundskeeper. I take care of the neighborhood, yes. He nodded once. I see. There was an uncomfortable silence. I pointed toward the survey marker. That's on my property. He glanced at it without concern. We'll verify that. I already have, I replied. I've lived here for 30 years. His smile widened. Sometimes people believe they've owned something for a long time. He took a step closer. That doesn't necessarily make it true. The words hit me harder than I expected. Before I could respond, he extended his hand. Harold Whitmore. His grip was firm, almost challenging. I'm the newly elected president of the Fairview Hills Homeowners Association. I frowned. New president? I thought Linda Foster was still serving. Mrs. Foster retired. He spoke as though the conversation bored him. The community voted for new leadership. I hadn't even known there'd been an election. Most maintenance employees weren't invited to HOA meetings, Harold continued. We're planning extensive improvements. He gestured toward the neighborhood entrance. New clubhouse. Expanded parking. Walking trails. He paused deliberately before adding, and your little cottage happens to occupy a very strategic location. I folded my arms. My cottage isn't for sale. I didn't ask if it was. For the first time, the politeness disappeared from his face. One of the younger men standing behind him chuckled. Harold noticed my expression and smiled again. The board will be in touch. Then all three climbed into the SUV and drove away. I stood there watching until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Something about that conversation stayed with me all day. Not because he'd threatened me, because he'd acted as though the outcome had already been decided. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. It was taped directly to my front door. Notice of HOA violation. I actually laughed. There had to be some mistake. I opened the envelope. According to the notice, my mailbox violated updated architectural guidelines. My porch light wasn't an approved fixture. My vegetable garden exceeded allowable dimensions. The color of my shutters no longer matched the neighborhood design standards. Fine, $850. Correction deadline, 7 days. I read it twice before walking straight to the HOA office. The receptionist barely looked up. I'd like to speak with Mr. Whitmore. Appointment? No. Then you'll need one. It's about this violation. She glanced at the paperwork. He signed it. I'd like to ask why. Without another word, she disappeared into the hallway. A minute later, Harold stepped out. He looked almost amused to see me. Mr. Bennett, I've lived here for decades. Nobody has ever said my shutters were against the rules. He took the notice from my hands. The governing documents were updated. When? Last month. I never received anything. They were emailed. I don't use email. That's unfortunate. His tone was completely flat. I still deserve notice. You received notice. He held up the paper. You're holding it. I took a slow breath. This feels personal. He leaned closer until only I could hear him. It isn't personal. It's business. Then he quietly added, although, if you simply agreed to sell your property, most of these issues would disappear. There it was. The real reason. I looked him straight in the eye. I'm not selling. His smile vanished. That's your decision. The violations multiplied. Every week brought another envelope. My fence was allegedly 2 inches too high. The bird feeder violated wildlife regulations. A wheelbarrow left beside my shed counted as unsightly outdoor storage. Each fine was larger than the last. I appealed every single one. Every appeal was denied. Then neighbors started treating me differently. People I'd worked beside for years suddenly avoided eye contact. One afternoon, Mrs. Daniels quietly crossed the street while I was watering flowers. She looked over both shoulders before speaking. Sam, they're telling everyone you're refusing to follow community rules. I frowned. I've never refused anything. She lowered her voice. Harold says you're becoming hostile. Hostile? You've always been the nicest man here, she hesitated. I just thought you should know what people are hearing. That evening I found something even worse. A bright red notice had been nailed to my front door. Final demand. Failure to satisfy outstanding HOA assessments may result in liens, foreclosure proceedings, and removal from the property. My hands actually shook. Foreclosure? Over flower beds and a mailbox? As I pulled the notice free, headlights flooded my yard. A sheriff's deputy stepped out of his cruiser. Mr. Bennett? Yes? We received a complaint. What kind of complaint? He looked uncomfortable. The HOA alleges you've been threatening board members. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. Then I realized the truth. This was never about landscaping. It was never about violations. Someone wasn't just trying to pressure me into leaving. Someone was building a legal case to erase me completely. And for the first time, I understood I wasn't fighting an overreaching HOA anymore. I was fighting people who had been planning this long before I ever saw that orange survey stake. The deputy studied my face for several seconds before saying another word. He wasn't reaching for his handcuffs. He wasn't resting a hand on his sidearm. He looked confused. "Mr. Bennett," he said carefully, "would you mind telling me what happened from your perspective?" I stepped off the porch and handed him the red notice. "This happened." He read it slowly. Then he looked back at me. "And the threats? I've never threatened anyone in my life." He nodded, almost as if that matched what he was seeing. "The complaint says you confronted Mr. Whitmore outside the HOA office yesterday and told him he'd regret taking your property." I blinked. "I told him I'd see him in court if he kept filing false violations." The deputy let out a quiet breath. "That's not exactly the same thing." "No." He folded the complaint and handed it back. "I still have to file a report because a complaint was made, but based on what I'm seeing, I don't have grounds to take any action." Before leaving, he glanced at the cottage. "My grandparents lost their home to a bad land deal years ago." His voice softened. "If I were you, I'd start keeping copies of everything." That advice turned out to be worth more than either of us realized. The next morning, I dug an old metal filing cabinet out of my garage. Margaret had bought it at a yard sale decades earlier. Inside were 30 years of records, property tax receipts, insurance policies, repair invoices, old photographs, utility bills. I spent hours sorting everything into neat stacks across my kitchen table. At first, I was simply trying to defend myself against the HOA's endless fines. But as I looked through those papers, something strange caught my attention. Every property tax bill listed my cottage exactly the same way. Parcel 17B. No changes, no disputes, no easements, nothing unusual. Yet Harold kept insisting the HOA had authority over my property. That didn't make sense. Late that afternoon, I drove to the Williamson County Register of Deeds office. The clerk behind the counter, a woman named Elaine Porter, smiled politely. "How can I help you?" "I'd like a copy of every recorded document related to parcel 17B. She typed for a few moments, then frowned. "That's odd." "What is?" "There are 2 files attached to the same parcel." I leaned closer. "There shouldn't be." "I know." She clicked through several screens. "One chain of title goes back continuously to your purchase with your wife. And the second," she hesitated, "it appears to have been added much later." "When?" She turned the monitor slightly so I could see. "About 20 years ago." 20 years. The exact year Nora, Grace, and Emily came to live with me. A cold feeling settled into my chest. Elaine printed several pages. "I'm not saying anything improper happened." She lowered her voice. "But I've worked here 23 years. I've never seen duplicate ownership records entered like this." I stared at the paperwork. One document bore an unfamiliar signature. Another referenced an HOA easement that I had never signed. The recording stamp looked legitimate, but something about the formatting felt off. The margins didn't match older county filings. Even the typeface looked newer than documents supposedly created years earlier. Elaine noticed me studying the pages. "If I were you..." She looked around to make sure no one else was listening. "I'd speak with a real estate attorney." I didn't know many lawyers. In fact, I knew exactly one. Michael Lawson. He'd been a young associate when Margaret and I bought the cottage decades earlier. Now, according to the brass plaque outside his office, he was one of the most respected property attorneys in the county. I wasn't sure he'd even remember me. His receptionist smiled. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She gave me an apologetic look. "Mr. Lawson is booked for the next 3 weeks." I nodded. "I understand." I turned to leave. Just then, an office door opened. A grey-haired man stepped into the hallway, carrying a coffee mug. He froze. "Sam?" I looked up. It took me a second. "Michael?" His face broke into a grin. "I'll be damned." He walked over and shook my hand with both of his. "I haven't seen you since Margaret's funeral." His smile faded as he looked more closely at me. "You look tired." "I am." He didn't ask another question. Instead, he turned to his receptionist. "Cancel my next meeting." She looked surprised. "But the Henderson closing, it can wait." He looked back at me. "If Sam Bennett walked into my office without an appointment after 30 years, he motioned toward the conference room. Something's very wrong." For nearly 2 hours, I laid everything on the table. Every violation, every fine, every photograph, every county record. Michael hardly spoke. He simply organized the documents into careful piles. Finally, he picked up the duplicate property filing and adjusted his glasses. His expression changed instantly. "Where did you get this?" "The county." He compared it with the original deed I'd brought from home. Then he stood up without saying a word and walked to a bookshelf filled with old real estate law books. When he came back, his face had gone pale. "This," he tapped the duplicate filing, "shouldn't exist." "What do you mean?" He looked me straight in the eye. "Sam, someone didn't just file bad paperwork." He slid both documents side by side across the table. "The legal description on this newer document contains language that wasn't even authorized for use in Tennessee property filings until 3 years after the date printed on it." I stared at him. "You mean?" He nodded slowly. "The document claiming your land belongs under HOA control appears to have been created years after it was supposedly recorded." He paused. "And if I'm right," he carefully closed the file, "we're no longer dealing with a civil property dispute." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "We're looking at evidence of a felony." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The word felony echoed in my mind. I'd spent my entire life avoiding trouble. I paid my taxes on time. I returned borrowed tools cleaner than I'd received them. If I accidentally mowed a few inches onto a neighbor's lawn, I'd apologize. Now an experienced real estate attorney was telling me that someone may have committed a felony to take my home. I finally found my voice. "Are you absolutely sure?" Michael Lawson leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "I've practiced property law for 35 years, Sam. I don't make accusations unless I can prove them." He slid the forged document back toward me. "Look here," he pointed to the legal description. "See this reference to the Fairview Hills Master Development Amendment?" I nodded. "That amendment wasn't approved by the county until 3 years after this document claims it was recorded." I frowned. "So whoever created this used language that didn't even exist yet." He gave a slow nod. "Either someone altered an older filing after it was recorded, or someone manufactured an entirely new document and slipped it into the county records. Neither possibility sounded legal." Michael reached for his phone. "I'm calling a forensic document examiner. And after that? I'm requesting certified copies of every filing related to your parcel directly from the county archives, not the digital system." "Why?" "Because if someone tampered with electronic records, the archived originals may tell a very different story." The next 2 weeks became a blur of meetings. Michael brought in Linda Chavez, a retired county records supervisor who had spent 28 years overseeing property filings. She examined every page with a magnifying lamp. She measured ink density, compared recording stamps, even inspected tiny impressions left by old typewriters. 3 hours later, she removed her glasses. "I've seen forged deeds before." She tapped the duplicate filing. "But this one is clever." My stomach tightened. "Clever?" "They copied genuine county seals." She pointed to the recording stamp. "They even duplicated the clerk's initials." Michael asked the question I was afraid to hear. "Can you prove it's fake?" Linda smiled. "Oh, yes." She reached into her briefcase and produced an old reference binder. "The clerk whose initials appear here retired 6 months before this document was supposedly recorded." She flipped another page. "And this recording stamp wasn't introduced until 4 years later." I stared at the forged document. "So they made mistakes." "They made arrogant mistakes," Linda corrected. "They assumed no one would ever compare it with the county's historical equipment logs." Michael looked at me. "That's our smoking gun." Unfortunately, Harold Whitmore wasn't sitting still. 3 days after Linda finished her report, rumors spread through Fairview Hills like wildfire. According to the HOA newsletter, I was refusing to pay legitimate fines. According to neighborhood emails, I'd hired an attorney to delay community improvements. According to social media, I was costing homeowners millions in construction delays. Neighbors who had smiled at me for years suddenly looked away. One afternoon, I walked into the local grocery store. A man I'd known for over a decade shook his head as he passed. "You should have just sold, Sam." Another whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "People like him always play the victim." I kept walking. But every word hurt. The attacks became personal. Someone dumped bags of dead leaves across my front porch. My mailbox was smashed with a baseball bat. One morning, I found bright orange spray paint across my garage door. "Move out." Michael photographed everything. "Don't clean it yet." I looked at the vandalism. "You really think this is connected?" "I don't think." He handed his phone to an investigator he'd hired. "I document." Security cameras went up around my cottage that same afternoon, 3 nights later. One of them captured a black pickup truck pulling into my driveway just after midnight. A man wearing a hood climbed out carrying a gas can. He never made it to my porch. Motion-activated floodlights snapped on. The man panicked, dropped the can, and ran back to the truck. The cameras captured the license plate perfectly. The truck wasn't registered to Harold. It belonged to the landscaping company that had recently signed a multi-million-dollar contract with the HOA for the very expansion project Harold kept talking about. Michael smiled for the first time in weeks. They're getting desperate. Then came the biggest mistake of all. A plain white envelope appeared under my front door. No return address. Inside was a cashier's check for $750,000. Attached was a single typed note. Take the money. Sign the enclosed deed. Leave quietly. This is your last opportunity. There was no signature. Just the deed transferring my cottage to a holding company I'd never heard of. Michael stared at the documents for nearly a minute. Then he carefully placed everything into an evidence bag without touching it again. They've crossed another line. What do you mean? If they believed they were going to win in court, he held up the cashier's check, they wouldn't be trying to buy your silence. A week before trial, Michael requested one final meeting. When I arrived, every chair in his conference room was occupied. Linda Chavez was there. A forensic document examiner, a licensed surveyor, two former HOA board members who had quietly resigned years earlier. Even the sheriff's financial crimes investigator sat at the end of the table. Stacks of binders covered the conference table. Michael waited until everyone was seated. Then he looked around the room. 20 years ago, he said, someone began laying the groundwork to steal one man's property. He rested his hand on the largest binder. They forged records. They manipulated HOA authority. They created false violations. They spread lies. They attempted foreclosure. And when that failed, he held up the cashier's check. They tried bribery. He turned toward me. Sam, for the first time since this nightmare began, I don't want you thinking about surviving. I looked at him. I want you thinking about what justice looks like. The following Monday morning, we walked into the county courthouse, carrying 12 evidence binders, certified records from the archives, forensic reports, security footage, witness statements, and one secret witness Michael refused to identify until the moment they took the stand. As we approached the courtroom doors, he leaned over and quietly said, Harold thinks this is just another HOA lawsuit. He smiled. By lunchtime, he's going to realize he's been defending the wrong case all along. The courthouse was already packed when we arrived. Residents from Fairview Hills filled nearly every seat in the gallery. Some had come out of curiosity. Others came because they'd believed every rumor the HOA had spread about me. A few looked embarrassed the moment they saw me. Reporters stood along the back wall with notepads and cameras. What had started as a simple foreclosure hearing had quietly become one of the most talked-about legal battles in Williamson County. Michael leaned toward me before we entered. No matter what happens today, he said, don't react to anything Harold says. Let the evidence do the talking. I nodded, though my stomach felt like it was tied in knots. Inside, Harold Whitmore looked as confident as ever. His attorney, Richard Collins, organized several neat folders on the plaintiff's table and occasionally smiled toward the HOA board members seated behind him. Harold caught my eye and smirked. You still have time to settle, Sam. I didn't answer. Michael had warned me. The bailiff called the room to order. All rise. Judge Eleanor Watkins entered, took her seat and adjusted her glasses. We are here in the matter of Fairview Hills Homeowners Association versus Samuel Bennett. She looked at both legal teams. Counsel, are you ready to proceed? Both attorneys stood. Ready for the plaintiff, Your Honor. Ready for the defense, the judge nodded. Proceed. Richard Collins walked confidently before the jury box. Even though this was a bench trial, he spoke as though giving a polished lecture. Your Honor, this case is remarkably simple. He held up a copy of the HOA's governing documents. Mr. Bennett has ignored repeated notices. He displayed photographs of my vegetable garden. My client merely seeks enforcement of community standards. He showed pictures of my porch. My client has acted lawfully at every stage. Then came the stack of alleged violations: mailbox, fence, garden, shutters, storage, late fees, attorney fees, interest. The total flashed on a courtroom monitor: $398,400. $462.17. Several people in the gallery gasped. Richard folded his hands. The defendant has portrayed himself as a victim, he turned toward me. In reality, he simply refuses to follow the same rules as every other homeowner. Harold smiled proudly. Richard returned to his seat. Michael stood slowly. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he carried a single binder to the witness stand. Your Honor, he smiled politely. I agree with opposing counsel. Richard looked confused. This case is remarkably simple. The courtroom became quiet. Michael opened the binder. The HOA's entire claim depends upon one assumption. He held up the disputed property document, that Mr. Bennett's property legally falls under HOA authority. He placed the document on the evidence screen. If that document fails, he looked directly at Harold. Every fine, every lien, every foreclosure action collapses with it. Judge Watkins leaned forward. Proceed. The first witness was Linda Chavez. Michael guided her carefully through her qualifications: 28 years supervising county property records, certified document examiner, expert witness in multiple state courts. Then he handed her the disputed filing. Have you examined this document? I have. What did you conclude? Linda looked toward the judge. In my professional opinion, she paused, this filing was not created on the date it claims. Richard Collins immediately stood. Objection. Foundation. Michael calmly handed Linda another binder. Could you explain why? She smiled. The recording stamp shown here wasn't manufactured until 4 years after the alleged filing date. She turned another page. The clerk whose initials appear on the document had already retired. Another page. The formatting follows state filing standards that did not exist until years later. Silence filled the courtroom. Judge Watkins slowly wrote several notes. Richard tried to recover during cross-examination. Is it possible these were clerical errors? Linda answered without hesitation. 3 separate impossible errors on the same document. She shook her head. No. Next came the licensed surveyor. He unfolded a large aerial map. Colored boundary lines covered the screen. The HOA entrance, clubhouse expansion, and proposed parking lot. He pointed toward my cottage. All require parcel 17B. Michael asked the obvious question. What happens if Mr. Bennett keeps his property? The surveyor answered simply. The expansion project becomes physically impossible. Murmurs spread across the courtroom. Harold shifted uneasily in his chair. Then Michael played the security footage. The courtroom watched in silence as a hooded man carried a gasoline can toward my porch before running away under the floodlights. The license plate appeared clearly on the screen. Michael turned toward the investigating deputy. Who owned that truck? The landscaping contractor hired by Fairview Hills HOA. Richard objected again. Speculation. The deputy calmly produced DMV records. No speculation. Judge Watkins admitted them into evidence. Harold's confident smile disappeared. Finally, Michael called his last witness. The defense calls... He paused deliberately. Assistant United States Attorney Nora Hayes. The courtroom doors opened. Nora walked inside wearing a dark navy suit. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. 20 years had turned the frightened little girl I'd once tucked into bed into one of the most respected federal prosecutors in the state. Harold frowned. Richard whispered urgently. Neither of them looked comfortable anymore. Nora took the oath and sat down. Michael smiled gently. Miss Hayes, can you tell the court how you know Samuel Bennett? She looked directly at me before answering. He isn't just someone I know. Her voice trembled slightly. He is the man who raised me after my parents died. The courtroom became perfectly still. Michael nodded. And what is your current occupation? I'm an assistant United States attorney. He placed one final binder before her. Ms. Hayes, have you recently reviewed financial records related to Fairview Hills HOA? Yes. What did you find? Nora slowly opened the binder. Before she could answer, Harold Whitmore suddenly shot to his feet. His chair crashed backward onto the courtroom floor. No, he shouted. You can't bring that into this case. Judge Watkins slammed her gavel. Mr. Whitmore, sit down immediately. Harold ignored her. His face had turned ghost white as he stared at the binder in Nora's hands, because whatever was inside it, he already knew exactly what it proved. Harold stood frozen beside his overturned chair. For a long moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the low hum of the air conditioner. Judge Eleanor Watkins fixed him with a hard stare. Mr. Whitmore, Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "You will sit down." Harold didn't move. His attorney grabbed his sleeve and whispered urgently, "Harold, sit." Slowly, almost mechanically, he lowered himself back into his chair. His confidence was gone. His hands were shaking. Judge Watkins turned toward Nora. "You may continue." Nora thanked the court and opened the thick binder. "I obtained these financial records through lawful subpoena as part of an unrelated federal review involving interstate banking transactions." Richard Collins was on his feet again. "Objection, Your Honor, relevance." Michael responded immediately. "The financial motive behind the fraudulent property filings goes directly to the plaintiff's intent." The judge considered it for a moment, overruled. Nora walked to the courtroom monitor. The first document appeared on the screen. It was a spreadsheet of wire transfers. "These payments," Nora explained, "originated from Fairview Hills Development Partners, the company slated to build the HOA's expansion project." She highlighted several transactions. Over a period of 6 years, more than $2.3 million was transferred into consulting companies controlled by individuals closely connected to the HOA board. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Watkins struck her gavel once. "Order," Nora continued. "The consulting companies had no employees, no offices, no legitimate business activity. They existed solely to receive these payments." Michael afterwards the screen. "Who controlled those companies?" Nora clicked to the next page. Harold's name appeared, alongside 2 other board members. Several residents in the gallery gasped. One woman covered her mouth with both hands. Michael called one final witness. Former HOA treasurer Daniel Reeves. A man in his early 60s walked slowly to the witness stand. He looked exhausted. After taking the oath, he avoided looking at Harold. Michael asked quietly, "Mr. Reeves, why did you resign from the HOA board 3 years ago?" Daniel swallowed. "Because I realized what they were doing." "What were they doing?" Richard objected. Judge Watkins overruled him. Daniel took a deep breath. "The expansion project couldn't happen unless Samuel Bennett's cottage was removed." Michael nodded. "And what did the board decide?" Daniel looked directly at the judge. "They said buying his property would cost too much, so they decided to force him out instead." The courtroom fell silent again. Daniel continued. "They talked about changing architectural rules, creating violations, making the fines so overwhelming he'd eventually give up." Michael asked one final question. "Were the violations about neighborhood standards?" Daniel shook his head. "No. They were about breaking an old man." Harold closed his eyes. Judge Watkins requested a 30-minute recess before delivering her ruling. I sat quietly beside Michael. Neither of us spoke. Across the courtroom, Harold argued frantically with Richard Collins. Board members whispered among themselves. One quietly slipped out a side door. Another refused to make eye contact with anyone. When court reconvened, everyone stood. Judge Watkins looked over the hundreds of pages of evidence one last time. Then she began. "This court has reviewed the testimony, documentary evidence, expert reports, and applicable law." She removed her glasses. "What began as a routine HOA enforcement action has proven to be anything but routine." She looked directly at Harold. "The evidence establishes that documents were fraudulently created to manufacture HOA authority over Parcel 17B. She turned another page. "The court further finds that the plaintiff pursued enforcement actions based upon those fraudulent records." Another pause. "The resulting liens, fines, assessments and foreclosure proceedings are therefore null, void, and without legal effect." A wave of emotion swept through me. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Judge Watkins wasn't finished. "This court orders all liens immediately released, all fines permanently vacated. The defendant shall recover reasonable attorney's fees and litigation costs." She looked toward the clerk. "I am also referring this entire matter to the Williamson County District Attorney and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for potential criminal prosecution involving fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and elder financial exploitation." Harold's shoulders slumped. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked afraid. The bailiff stepped closer to the plaintiff's table as investigators entered quietly through the rear courtroom doors. One investigator approached Harold. "Mr. Whitmore, we'd like to speak with you." Harold looked at Richard. Richard slowly closed his briefcase. "I can't answer criminal questions for you. I can't answer criminal questions for you." Harold's face turned completely pale. The weeks that followed changed Fairview Hills forever. The HOA board resigned one after another. A court-appointed administrator took over the association, while state investigators reviewed years of financial records. Construction of the luxury expansion project was permanently cancelled. The forged documents were removed from the county record system, and replaced with certified originals, confirming my ownership had never changed. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me began knocking on my front door. Mrs. Daniels arrived first with a homemade peach pie. "I'm sorry, Sam," she said, tears in her eyes. "I should have believed the man I knew instead of the stories I heard." Others followed. Some apologized. Some simply shook my hand. A few admitted they had been intimidated into staying silent. I told every one of them the same thing. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we recognize them. As for me, I walked back onto my little front porch, looked across the garden Margaret and I had planted decades earlier, and watched 3 remarkable women laugh together beneath the old oak tree. The little girls I'd once promised to protect had grown into women who protected me. And in that moment, I realized something no court order could ever grant or take away. I hadn't lost my family. I'd raised one. 6 months have passed since the judge's ruling, and every morning still begins the same way, with a cup of black coffee on my front porch. The roses are blooming again. The vegetable garden is full. The old white cottage still creaks when the wind blows, and somehow that sound has never been more comforting. Fairview Hills feels different now. The fear is gone. Neighbors stop to chat instead of looking away, and children once again ride their bicycles down the same sidewalks I spent decades caring for. A new HOA board was elected with strict transparency rules, open meetings, and independent financial oversight, so that what happened to me could never happen to another homeowner. Nora visits whenever her schedule allows, though she still calls every Sunday just to make sure I'm eating enough vegetables. Grace jokes that she'll never stop checking my legal paperwork, and Dr. Emily insists on giving me a full checkup every time she comes over, even when I tell her I'm perfectly fine. I always lose that argument. Sometimes I sit on the porch and think about Margaret. I imagine her smiling as she watches the 3 little girls we welcomed into our home grow into women of integrity, courage, and compassion. She always believed love wasn't measured by blood. It was measured by the lives you chose to stand beside when they needed you most. This experience taught me something I'll never forget. The strongest people aren't always the richest, the loudest, or the most powerful. Sometimes they're the quiet ones who refuse to surrender their principles, even when the entire world seems determined to push them aside. And kindness is never wasted. You may not see its reward for years, but one day, it has a way of finding its way back home. Thank you so much for staying with me through this journey. If this story meant something to you, I'd genuinely love to hear from you. Have you, or someone you know, ever dealt with an abusive HOA or stood up against someone who thought they were above the law? Share your experience in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next unforgettable HOA drama. Until next time, remember this: the seeds of kindness you plant today may become the very people who stand beside you when you need them most. The end.